Jasmine.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please. Welcome everyone to the second of the webinars in this Sadler seminar series, Telling Stories. And today's topic of conversation is singing a new song, decolonising opera. And the impetus for today's webinar is a provocation made by one of our panelists in the last session, Imani Mosely, who questioned whether decolonisation of opera as a genre is even possible, and eager to pick up on that as an idea. Today's seminar will dig down, but also situate this conversation in the context of new operatic works. And to that end, we're delighted to be joined by Jasdeep Singh Degan, fresh from his triumphant Orpheus with Opera North, and also Robert Fokkens, who is currently touring, I'm going to say this wrong, aren't I? Bekititswe, a monodrama written in 2020, and we'll be hearing from both composers about their work in due course. Just a couple of house rules. Today's event is being recorded. It will be available online later. And if you weren't able to join our last event, that is also online. There are details on the project webpage. We'll be sharing a link at the end. But if you would like to know more about today's event, please do follow the QR code for information and links to all of the speaker biographies. You are encouraged to participate via chat and question and answer functions on Zoom. We're already the chat's there and people are communicating, so please do join us in this conversation. This is very much an exploration of these issues rather than a presentation on these issues. So the more interaction we have with the wider community, the better. And of course, some of the issues we might be talking about will inevitably touch on sensitive matters and involve terminology that may mean different things in different regions. So please, where possible, be courteous and considerate in your language. So thank you all. Thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you to the audience for coming. And I will hand the reins over now to Ariana to introduce properly this session. Thank you, Ariana.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ed. I would like to reiterate my my thanks to our panelists today. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you, as well as from the audience. So my name is Ariana Phillips-Hutton. I'm lecturer in Global Critical and Cultural Study of Music here at the University of Leeds. And I have the privilege of sort of chairing today's session. So we have chosen this subtitle, Decolonising Opera, and as Ed mentioned, this comes from a comment made at our last seminar by Imani Mosely. And this tension between, the aims of decolonisation and opera as a genre really does point us to, what is it possible that we're going to be asking artistic traditions, individual artists to do when we talk about decolonising. And that's something that we're going to be getting into, I think, today. But in preparing for this seminar, I was reminded of a comment that was made by the 20th century French avant-gardist Pierre Boulez. And he suggested that if anyone's serious about real artistic and social progress, the best thing to do is to burn down all of the opera houses. And so whether we take Boulez at his word or not, this highlights to me the fact that opera has a particular history as a genre that is deeply intertwined with wealth and privilege, spectacle, and it's often traded on ideas or representations of difference, and a kind of difference that can be represented without any repercussions. However, opera is also a space in which traditions of storytelling are being put to new uses, telling different kinds of stories, new works. And that is sort of the other half of our title today, singing new songs. I'm very much, again, looking forward to hearing from everyone on how we see, or we can talk about new works in relationship to operatic traditions. But we do have this kind of the D word, decolonizing, in the title. And because decolonization itself can mean many different things, I thought I might just start for a moment here to lay out some of the different things we might think of decolonization as signifying. And so for the first sort of type of decolonizing, we might think of it as reclaiming or revaluing particular knowledges, histories, practices, things that have been forgotten or indeed disrespected as a result of colonialism. On the other hand, we might think of decolonization as a process of challenging white or Western norms of behavior, norms of practice, identity, the things that move other people to margins or demand that they abandon something of themselves in order to participate. The third kind of aspect of decolonization that I'd like to sort of think about is the opportunity actually to create or give respect to new hybrid forms of identity or perhaps of music, ones that are produced as a fact of colonialism, as a fact of this collision of cultures, and perhaps we might get into some of that today. There is, of course, the literal reclamation of territory, repatriation, and that is something that we talked a little bit about in our last seminar. And then the final kind of aspect of decolonialism or decolonization that I'd like to bring up is this question of whether or not we can dismantle structures that are very deeply rooted in white supremacy and control, and indeed that would clear the ground for something new to be built. And regardless of the ways in which we take decolonization, which is itself deeply, deeply controversial, I don't want to skim over that kind of controversy. In a moment in which it has appeared in conversations with greater frequency and intensity, we wanted to take this opportunity to ask that question. Is it possible, or perhaps even more importantly, is it in fact desirable to decolonize opera? And perhaps if decolonization is a worthy goal, and I'm not suggesting necessarily that that's a given, what might that sound like? And so we've got a couple of different themes for today's seminar, but in fact, this is designed to be a pretty free-flowing discussion. So please do feel free to jump in at any point. But I thought I might start by inviting one of our panelists, Rob, to speak a little bit about the work that was mentioned, Decolonising, and particularly a bit about this is a story of a life that crosses many different boundaries, and it's told here in a partnership between yourself, the librettist, Makuli Mabija, and of course, a Welsh opera company. So I thought maybe you would share a little bit about your composition and the story, and also how it came about.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you, everyone, thank you for inviting me this afternoon, and thanks for joining us. So Becky's Izwe, the origins of the piece. So it's a monodrama. It's for a single performer in our show that we're doing at the moment, and in the film that we made a few years ago. The performer is Temba Mvula, who's a wonderful Zambian British baritone who's really quite exceptional. But the piece actually originates from my friendship with with a South African baritone called Njabula Madlala, who some of you may know. Njabula won the Kathleen Ferrier Prize for Song in the early 2000s. And I've known him for a while, and we sort of joked about, writing a solo opera for him. He was quite taken by is it El Cid by Henser, which is a big famous and very hard challenging monodrama. So the piece sort of stems from that conversation, and gradually over time, for various reasons, not least I've always been quite interested in small scale work generally. I've sort of sung in opera actually. I was in the opera chorus in Cape Town when I was 18 as an ad hoc member. So the sort of experience of grand opera is something that I value enormously. But I'm also always struck by the sheer cost of opera, which I think is a kind of a big theme that goes through all of the creation of opera. The sheer cost of it and the issues around that is something I've always found interesting. And actually, I was quite intrigued by how do you harness the power of words, music, drama, without necessarily having to have 200 people involved in making the show. So that was one driver, and many other drivers. But eventually, I also came to the point where I said to Njibula, actually, I think this is a good idea. Shall we do this? And he was quite enthusiastic. And so the starting point for the piece then was sitting down in a room with him in early 2018, with him and the director of the current production and the film, Ben Davis. The three of us sat down in a room for a few days and thrashed out a sort of an outline of a story. And the story is about a sort of young South African man who grows up in sort of last years of apartheid in South Africa, has some pretty traumatic experiences, but sort of kind of grows through them. Turns out to be very, very talented, very gifted mathematician, as it turns out. He comes over to the UK to study, and the story kind of carries on then through his experiences in the UK. And the reason I tell you that, sorry, is not to try and sell you the story, but to explain that there's a certain biographical element to that for Njibula, who the story has some resonances there. It's not biographical about him at all, but there are certain elements of that story. He is a young Zulu South African who came over to study in the UK in the early 2000s, having kind of grown up through apartheid. It's also worth saying it's a story that is partially connected to my story. I'm a young South African who grew up in the last years of apartheid and came over to study in the UK. Obviously, my experience of it is radically, of that sort of story is radically different. Mkhululi, our librettist, who he also has that experience of having grown up the last few years of apartheid. He's a little bit younger than us, but he grew up then and went over to New York to study. So the experience of sort of otherness, of coming from that very kind of difficult racialized sort of space and coming over to either the UK or to the US and experiencing what it means to be othered in so many different ways, I suppose, is what really drives the piece fundamentally. So yes, does that give you this what you're looking for, Ariana?
That's great. We're very happy to hear more about the story and about its origins. I just wondered if I might. We've had the opportunity, very kindly given by Rob, to see this particular production, and it ends with a really wonderful sort of moment, that a call to let your voices ring for freedom, let us work for a brighter dawn, fill our streets with stomping feet, make the world tremble with our freedom song. Really, I find it quite a powerful and moving moment in that monodrama. But I wondered if you might say a little bit about what you think that this call, what are you hoping for as a way of kind of engaging with artists and audiences?
So I think sort of underlying a lot of my work and my thinking about creativity is the idea that when one sort of restricts oneself to narrow kind of bands of thought or ideas or influences, one narrows oneself, one narrows one's worldview, and that to open one's mind up to possibility as broadly as possible allows you to be far more creative, I think. And so I think the sort of driving force, like I say, of all of my creative work, and I think also of my teaching, it's something I talk about a lot with students. Listen, find everything, listen to whatever you can, read scores, but listen to music that is unscored from wherever you can. Trying to kind of fill one's mind with richness, I guess, and drawing on that then in your creativity, I think is really, really important for just for the richness of that as a creator, and for the richness of your own kind of creative well-being. But I think also from a sort of a broader cultural perspective, I think in similar sort of terms, I suppose, that, we gain so much by interaction with people who are different to us, and we are all enriched by that. And I suppose that's sort of fundamentally what the piece is about. So sort of thinking, if we put ourselves in boxes, and I suppose a lot of this comes for me out of my experience coming, through school, particularly, and through university, just at the very end of apartheid. I was at university literally. I started university the year that apartheid formally ended in 1994. And so kind of growing up in that time, you sort of saw how powerfully apartheid divided people. It's what it tried to do, and it was actually very effective because it kind of played into people's underlying fears and made people kind of go, I should be this, and I can be this, and I can't be this, and I can't be that. And those walls and those barriers actually, I think, was deeply detrimental to South African society, obviously. I mean, a very simple musical example of that, for if you look at the opera world in South Africa, until the 1990s, and actually I mentioned in 1993, I sang with the, 1994, excuse me, I was singing with the Cape Town Opera Chorus, slightly inappropriate because I was 18, but I was invited by my ex-teacher who was then running the chorus, and I was actually part of that chorus. But at the same time, the first group of Black South African singers was invited to Cape Town Opera to be part of a sort of what they called a choral training program. So that's 1994, the very first time that had happened in South Africa, that they would have Black singers in the building and allowed to perform on the stage as part of the opera company. And if you look at the vast a range of talent that was lost by not allowing that to that point. I mean, if you look at the South African opera scene now, and some of you will be aware of this, there are many South African singers now, both internationally but also in South Africa, who are singing big standard repertoire, and the wealth of voices that one then kind of thinks, well, what happened before 1994? Were these people not singing? Did they not exist? Well, obviously they were, but that was lost to South African society and to South African musical culture, in terms of the world of opera. So I guess I don't know if that's sort of answering your question, but those are the sort of things that are going on in my mind when I'm thinking about all of this.
That lived experience is so seems to be so significant in your own work and thinking about how you're also now teaching students. I wonder if you might say, sorry, I'm just trying to draw out all of these themes as a way of kind of setting up a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. I just wonder if you might say a little bit more about actually bringing this production to the stage, that process of actually getting the opera company involved and working with this as a stage work.
So basically the piece got, so we workshopped the piece. As I said, we sat down together, and Jabula and Ben and myself, we sat down, we sort of made a scenario essentially together, which I then invited Nkuludi to work with me as librettist. The two of us worked together on the first couple of scenes. We did a workshop that was funded by Arts Council Wales at the end of 2018 with Njabulo singing, actually. We had just 3 days just to kind of knock it and put it together. And then about a year and a half later, I started thinking, okay, we need to make this project happen because there's something special here in my view, obviously. And we approached Opera Draig, which is a female-led young opera company in Cardiff, who made the Arts Council application, Arts Council Wales, and they've essentially supported the film. We got the money from Arts Council Wales for a tour that we'd originally planned on I think the 9th of March 2020, and 10 days later we were not going on tour anymore. So we then turned it into the film that you've seen, that some of you will have seen, and which was put out through the BBC Wales and the Festival of Voice, which is the Wales Millennium Centre online festival they had in 2021. And so then we applied for a bit more money, feeling a bit greedy, and we thought we'd really love to put this on live. And so we applied for some more money from Arts Council Wales. We've had a lot of support from Cardiff University as well. And that's why we're now putting it on stage in the next few weeks. We start rehearsing on Monday. Is that what you were asking? Or
No, actually thinking through the role of institutions and funding is actually really significant when we talk about not just questions about decolonisation, but the whole process of getting new works to the stage. So
Yes.
thinking through those kinds of relationships is actually really significant.
I think it is one of the challenges. I mean, anybody who's ever tried to make opera independent of a large company will know that, you know, it's a challenging hand-to-mouth kind of business, and we've been enormously fortunate. Arts Council Wales has been very generous in supporting the project the whole way through, and we've had some nice grants from them, which has allowed us to do all of these things. And as I say, Cardiff University has actually been enormously supportive of the project as well, in various different ways, whether practical or financial. Or this process started during a sabbatical that I had. So I think those, you know, that's been the major support, and then the various venues that we've taken the show to, and the festival that we put it out on last year. We put the film out on last year. So the Torch Theatre, where I am today, in Milford Haven, and Chapter was enormously supportive. Chapter Arts Centre in Cardiff, they actually helped us make the film. They gave us space for free to rehearse and film. You know, so there's been an enormous amount of support, but more from a theatre point of view, more from the independent theatres around Wales. Rather than the big institutions. But Arts Council Wales really has been enormously supportive. So, you know, we've been very lucky, I think, and it's felt very it's felt like people have been interested to see what this piece might be about, and we've never felt that we've had to fight anybody to do this.
Brilliant, wonderful. I wonder if I might actually bring in, we've got a number of people on the panel who are deeply involved as practitioners in opera, and I wonder if we might open up a space for discussion here on kind of the constraints and possibilities for new operatic works, particularly in relationship to this idea that there are new stories out there to be told. I wonder if anyone has any kind of initial thoughts about their own particular roles, or the roles of the institutions and in that space.
Sorry, Lucia.
Yeah. Hi, Ariana and Rob. I have some questions. It's about the role, because I think multiple things in the new monodrama, and it's very interesting to see the international student, and he's married with a white girl, and he's worried about his son is a half white and half black. I'm sorry to say that, but I'm wondering why do you decide such things in this new drama, because it's like a representative the contradictions between different race or different culture, or combination of the different culture. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of that was driven by Njabulo's experience, I guess, and a lot of people who have, you know, been in a situation, especially coming from the sort of divided space of South Africa, but even within the UK, I think people historically have found being a parent of a mixed race child, so being in a mixed race relationship is often quite difficult, certainly historically. And interesting enough, Themba Mvula, our baritone who you've seen performing the piece, Themba responded to the piece very strongly because he has precisely that background. His father's Zambian, his mother is a white British woman. And he talked very movingly about how his grandparents felt enormously uncomfortable with this arrangement, and so the sort of that sort of tension, I think, where he comes over to the UK expecting everything to be sort of, you know, easier and less racially divided and less complex, really, in terms of interpersonal relationships. He brings into that his own kind of traumatic experiences of white people in South Africa, and then also comes to the UK, and instead of it being very straightforward, he meets this lovely girl, Sarah. You know, they fall in love. It all works out from that perspective, but her parents really aren't so sure about that. So I think it was about bringing those kind of sort of exploring the experience, really, of, you know, what happens to people in these situations. And obviously other people have had completely different stories. You know, I'm not suggesting that this is a totally kind of, this is how it is. I'm saying we are talking about people that we know and people who've had experiences like this, and trying to kind of, again, sort of, it's about sort of him, about Becky Zizwe himself, the main character, and him trying to sort of work out how to exist in this mixed space, in the space where he can't be himself entirely because he's not in South Africa. He's not surrounded by the culture and the people that have nurtured him. So he sort of needs to come. He needs to sort of find and build that community of people around him and that space around him. And the challenges of that, I suppose, is and the difficulties and the decisions you have to make to either to kind of go with that or kind of just give up and go back, or whatever it might be. I think that's really what the piece is about. And so yes, I think that's why has been that's why it's a big part of the piece, to kind of put him in that situation where he is having to deal with those things, which I think are very real. I don't think this is an unusual experience, actually. Certainly again, we all thought before 2010, I think, that the world was a much happier place and everybody got on nicely. But I think we all know that's not true now, if we ever suspected it was. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Ed, you're currently muted, but you've got your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, well, we've got a couple of questions from the audience. So first, on the institutional front, why you've been asked, Rob, why did you approach Arts Council Wales for funding and not South Africa? How does this relate, I guess, to the infrastructure in the two countries?
That's a very good question. Quite simply because it's very, very difficult to raise money in South Africa. And I would very much like to take this piece to South Africa and to have it supported, to have it performed around South Africa. But opera companies in South Africa, there are two sort of main companies, I guess, which, well, there's one main company, which is Cape Town Opera, and there are a few other sort of companies that are more or less full-time or ad hoc. So the funding for opera in South Africa is extremely limited, despite the fact that we now have an enormous group of really quite exceptional singers around the country. So in terms of trying to raise that money, and also just from a straightforward practical perspective of me being in Wales, having a job in Wales, being able to kind of go over to South Africa and work there for a long time would have been very tricky. But I think fundamentally, trying to get things funded in South Africa is difficult. What's of course interesting, and talking about decolonising opera, this is maybe something we can discuss later on. What's very interesting about the South African opera scene at the moment, we have, like I say, all these fantastic black singers and many white singers, mixed race singers. There's a real kind of there's a great community, but there's very, very little work for them, first of all. So the Cape Town Opera, for example, is churning out singers every year, and they're, I mean, they're not all absolutely exceptional, but there's a very large number of very fine singers coming out of Cape Town Opera School and various other places in Pretoria and Tshwane. So there's no shortage of talent, but there's very, very little money. And so apart from anything else, it felt wrong to kind of say, hey guys, I'm in this position where where I can kind of contemplate doing something like this. Why don't you give me some money to do that? It felt more important that what money there is should be going to support, the sort of local infrastructure. And also, the other issue is that new work in South Africa is very hard to put on and very hard to sell. It's hard everywhere, as we all know, but it's particularly hard, I think. The opera singers in South Africa want to sing Verdi and they want to sing Puccini and Mozart. They don't necessarily. There are obviously many exceptions, but they don't necessarily want to pitch themselves at this, and the audiences don't necessarily yet want to kind of pitch themselves at this sort of thing. I'm not saying that that's an insurmountable barrier, but it's to say that all of those concerns just meant that it seemed to me the best way to kind of get this done was to do it through Wales.
That sort of those realities, those institutional realities, are definitely running as a thread through this. And I'm just picking up on the comment made by Mia in the chat that institutions are crucial, and that they are representative, as Mia says, of colonial networks of patronage and circulation, or modern networks. And it's very hard to disentangle, or possibly impossible to disentangle those sorts of things. And I know that we had another question from Neve about representation in opera, telling new stories. And I actually think that this might be a way of kind of segueing into one of our other sort of themes for today, which is a question about the relationship between diversity in casting, diversity in storytelling, diversity in production, and decolonization. Those things are perhaps not always compatible or not always pulling in the same direction. So I wonder if this might be an opportunity to bring in Jasdeep, who I know from attending the seminar on Friday has some very interesting experiences to think through these sorts of things. So Jasdeep, I wonder if I might invite you to speak a little bit on this kind of question of tokenism and diversity and how that has played out in relationship, perhaps to Orpheus or perhaps to other.
Sure. Hi. It's a tough one. So my background is in Indian classical music. So I'm an Indian classical musician and composer, but I grew up with some Western classical training as well throughout my life. So it was always kind of parallel going. Orpheus was a coming together of both the styles based on Monteverdi's La Orfeo, which is the kind of first published opera, other things. So really that was the blueprint was Monteverdi's opera, but it was coming together of the two styles. So before I got called to come into the project quite late into its kind of development in terms of cerebral kind of thought process of what it should be. And I'm sure Dom from Opera North can kind of expand on that. But as an Indian classical musician working in the UK and being born and brought up in Leeds, I've had my fair share of doing projects that have been absolutely excruciatingly awful. Whenever people have said I want, because I'm a sitar player as well, so that I get called to do so many sessions on so many productions of where sitar is the token instrument, and I have been the token musician on various projects up and down the country. I'm 31 years old now. So this is the kind of work I was doing when I was 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So taking part in any projects that do feel tokenistic, I can actually firmly say that I don't ever touch with a bargeful, because I don't need to kind of subject myself to that, when it comes to cross-cultural projects. So when I got the call for Orpheus, of course, it was my teacher, Ustad Dharanbir Singh, and Lawrence Cummings, who had a first kind of initial conversation about bringing Monteverdi and Indian classical music together. And then my teacher was kind of very keen for me to get involved, and which I did, but at a very late stage. And at that point, I think the thinking was just like, we'll have Monteverdi with kind of Indian instruments there, and we'll see what kind of happens. Whereas when I heard that, I was like, I'm not sure I want to take part, because being trained as an Indian classical musician, I didn't want to bring Indian classical music to a main stage opera, especially in Leeds, that felt tokenistic and reductionist towards Indian classical music. So I was very, very firm with my teacher, with everyone that was involved, to say, actually, unless it was an equal coming together of both styles, I'm not that interested in taking part. And which I think everyone at Opera North felt that this was something that we needed to get right. But not necessarily having the right, knowing the right way of doing that. I have a background in bringing in the Indian classical music and Western classical music together. I wrote a sitar concerto with Opera North about 3 or 4 years ago as well, and all my work has always been quite in both worlds. I see myself more as an Indian classical musician than I do as a Western classical musician in that sense. But it was very, very important that the coming together was equal and in parity. So that actually meant that half of the opera had to be Indian classical music. There was no compromise on that. Like there's no point in me just going in there and playing some Monteverdi on sitar, because that for me is reductionist and tokenistic. I can do that with my embellishments of Indian classical music. Fair enough, that's fine, and that is also a way in of doing things. And we did do that in the opera as well, but it couldn't just be that, if you understand what I mean. So it was half of the libretto got translated into in South Asian languages, because the singers from Indian classical tradition, it doesn't make sense for them to sing in Italian or English, because that's not how we train. And the repertoire then also had to be based on Indian classical music. And that's where I came in as a composer and composed repertoire very, very much so based on Indian classical music. But taking some ideas from the Monteverdi, some motifs, some riffs, or something that found a link. And of course, there was all the musical decisions that needed to be taking into consideration that were informed by Monteverdi. So, for example, if one particular passage was in G, in the key of G, just to segue into the next bit, that also had to be in the key of G. Just these are very, very simple things that you just had to kind of make it more seamless. But then getting more on a technical point of view, how do you bring improvisation, which is predominantly what Indian classical music is, based on improvisation? How do you bring that together with a repertoire that is all based on fixed material? That in itself is how do you bring them kind of musicians in the room together? And that was very important. So I always said this, that the process of working on the opera was more important to me than the end result. That's because all the Indian classical musicians don't read Western music, and I don't think they should have done. For this project, you can't just put a score and be like, read this and do this. It's like, that's not how we've trained, and there's no point unless a person wants to actually do that. Why are you putting them into a context that almost cuts off their limbs to be able to make music in the way that they normally do? So it made no sense to do that. So I think the way that I got around it was, if everyone was equally unhappy with how the process is going, we're in a good position to do it, because everyone had to be out of their comfort zone, but in a way that was obviously manageable, and the respect of the both traditions had to be maintained at all costs. So that meant, like, when I was going to my Indian classical musicians, I was saying, look, a lot of the music will be fixed, but you have to get on it, and we're going for that end result, and you have to just suck it up and do it. I know you can do it. And to the Western musicians, I was like, some of the material is going to be, there's no music there. You're going to have to learn it by ear. That's how we do things. So just suck it up and do it, because we're all in the room, and just do it. Like, we're all human. We all know music. Everyone can go la 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 la, if that's whether that's in Western music or it's the same music, So ultimately, the end result is the musical thing, but the processes of how we got there are very, very different. But we have to. It was very important to me that each tradition was respected in a way, so in the room everyone felt on an equal footing, and that's what I've always been battling against, because growing up in England, being a minority musician, playing a minority music tradition, I've always had to compromise and bend over backwards. I read and write music in the Western tradition. I've only done that so then I was able to be tangible in a room to work with other musicians. I was forced to do that almost as a kid, and yes, it's made me a better musician going forward, but should that really be the case when you're trying to work with people that haven't trained in a particular style of music? And opera companies and Western classical musicians now have to be versatile. How many opera companies do session music for film composers who don't read and write music, who do everything on Logic? You have to be a musician of the 21st century, and that's being able to sight read, to be able to if someone plays a few things, you should be able to pick that up, or just be open to working in a different style. We've gone past the age of, like, if it's not written down on a piece of paper, I can't play it, and I'm out of my comfort zone, and I'm not going to engage. That's not the way of music, in my opinion. So it was really bringing this this way of music making to a company that is very, very, I wouldn't say rigid in its ways, because they've allowed us to do that. You know, they've given us a platform to do that. But traditionally, that's what opera companies are seen as, you know, as this elitist, very, very unwielding musicians that you cannot get any way into. For me, I don't think that's the way forward to work in this day and age. You know, we have everything by our phones. I can watch an opera on my phone. I can watch an Indian classical concert on my phone. I can watch Japanese classical music on my phone, and get that thing. You know, we live in such a different environment than we did 50 years ago. So we need to move with the times. And I think with Orpheus, for me, the process was more important, and I've really felt that in the room with all the musicians there. Everyone just got stuck in. Everyone was for the music, regardless of it being Monteverdi or Indian classical music. Everyone was there for the music, and that for me was the most. That was the reason why I enjoyed the project the most, you know, and doing it was seeing the result of the power of music in that scenario. And I think, you know, looking at the reviews and how that's been with the audiences, that really does come across. So yeah, so this is, I mean, I can talk about this like for ages, but I hope you get a bit of an insight into what the process has been the interesting thing, and something that we should focus on as well.
Absolutely, thank you. We've got a question over there. Ed, is that an old hand?
Oh no, it's a new hand. So thank you very much, Jazz and Rob. I mean, it's one of the things that struck me both when you were talking about your operatic work is the different kind of approaches. In the one hand, with Rob, we've got new stories being told, and in Jazz's case, old stories being told in a new way, and with that emphasis on process as well in both cases. And I think this is this is motivated as well by Neve's question, and a question that she made last time as well about, you know, considerations of opera as a genre, which is obviously to the fore in the reception of both of these works, but also opera as both a culture and a community. And Jazz, a lot of the things you're talking about seem to point especially strongly towards the ways in which decolonisation, or however you want to term it, might be something that's a process rather than end product. It might be something that one always does. And how the end result is perceived by audiences, as you say, might matter less from the cultural and community point of view than it does from a generic point of view. So there is a question that comes from this. Well, two questions, slightly different for both Jazz and Rob. So Jazz, in your case, here you are bringing the traditions together, but in a sense on Opera North turf, that it was premiered in the Grand Theatre to the type, to an audience who will be exposed to the work through the Opera North publicity machine. I know, and primarily, but also South Asian, that's UK as well. So in a sense, it's received on opera's grounds. And this is something Maggie Kubaniova was talking about in our first webinar as well, that you can bring people together, but we've always got this sense of invitation onto someone's territory, and this took place on Opera North's territory. So in the first instance, my question to you, Jazz, will be what might Orpheus have looked like were it to have been conceived for and premiered within the Indian classical tradition on, locations there? So that's my first question. And Rob, just before I forget, I'll ask you so you can also be percolating over this. Here we've got new stories, but being presented in the opera as a genre, which in sort of looking at Mia's comments here, still brings with it its colonial past. And so we get this tension between a new story telling, giving voice to experiences that don't habitually live in the opera house, but through the vehicle of opera. So I wondered if you might comment shortly on how you perceive and reconcile those tensions. Sorry, that was a very long comment / question. But Jazz, I think first of all, how would this look if it wasn't in the Grand Theatre but elsewhere?
Two ways. Hopefully the music would have been the same. I probably would have done if I'd been commissioned by either company. Because Indian classical music doesn't have a operatic tradition like within it. It's not a narrative tradition in that sense. It probably would have been more a concert than a staging, unless an Indian company wanted to do an opera and have it staged. And I'd like to think that it would have been the same, but the process would have been very, very different. I was just in a meeting with Dom and we were talking about this, is that actually because opera is a big machinery, especially with a company like Opera North, it is a big machine. There are 200 people working on the thing. So to do something slightly different takes a lot of effort to kind of move the big lorry, if you know what I mean. If you're trying to just veer it into a thing. So when someone says, sorry, there's no score that the stage management can follow, like everything just like is up in the air. Everyone's like panicking. Is that how do we do this opera without if nothing's written down? So it sends a whole sense of panic and things into the air. So that's one of the kind of challenges, is that how do you get a company that has traditionally done things for hundreds of years in a certain manner? How do you get them to change a track depending on the opera that they're doing, especially when you're bringing in people from outside of the tradition, outside of the genre? So the challenges that I've faced the most was actually just being like, well, there's no score. And in an Indian classical concert or a company, they would understand that, so well. So we just get on and do it, So I have felt that there have been barriers about kind of in terms of how I wanted to do things quickly and effectively, but not being able to do that without reiterating a point 5 times to 5 different people who all get it but just can't change a thing. So that's been the biggest challenge, is like, can people just listen to me? And just like, it's so obvious that it needs to be like this, and that's been the biggest challenge. Had I done that in a different organization that knew Indian classical music, that these would be, I wouldn't have to blink an eyelid. Do you know what I mean? There would be, but I'm sure there would be a different set of challenges coming up. However, saying that, because being an Indian classical musician based in this country, we are from the beginning, we know how Western classical music works. We always talk about our own tradition in parallel to Western classical. Every time I've done a lectem, I talk about the sitar, I talk about modes, I talk about keys, I talk about notes on the piano, I talk about all these things. Everything is in relation to Western classical music because you're telling a Western audience. That's how we train, because we train in this country. So at every moment, we're always much more aware of how the other side works, and that's how it's been in the project. I because I've worked with so many musicians, I can follow a score. I know how to do that. I know how to talk to them. Tangible. I can follow a conductor. All this stuff I can do. Unfortunately, because there isn't much of a person could work for Opera North and never have any contact with any other genre of music. Even being in Leeds, they could do that because the infrastructure is there, and there is no need to engage with other art forms, because why would they, when if unless you're actively seeking that out and doing it? I'm just giving an example. I'm not saying it's a thing, but for us, we know how to work in different contexts because we live in England, and we've done so from day one. When I was even in school, I was in the school orchestra playing sitar. That in itself was a thing that I had to do when I was 10. So so I do feel like Indian classical musicians in this country are a lot more versatile because of the context that we've been born and brought up into, and then that translates in the room, where all my musicians were very, very tangible, doing things and just getting stuck into it and just doing it. But there was a bit of pushback from the Western musicians, but we don't sing by ear. We don't, it's just, sometimes it was like, come on, just do it, man. And that really came to the forefront. But yeah, that's the thing, is that because we're a minority tradition as well as a minority race as well, in terms of racial minority, we've always had to live. Our life experience, our lived experiences are so different from a typical white man born and brought up in Leeds, So that has a big a thing, it does impact the way that we work. And I think we're more versatile in that sense of working in the opera tradition. I think a lot of the Western classical musicians would have found it very, very difficult had it been an Indian classical organization running things. But then again, because we're so much more versed into how our music fits alongside Western classical music, I think that would be easier anyway for the Western musicians. And that's the kind of not very pleasant thing, because there isn't equality in that sense because of where we're placed. So we shouldn't be trying to say, oh, well, we've got to make it equal and everything is equal, but it really isn't. But we've got to understand that it isn't equal and have them conversations very openly, And I think that would be going forward with Opera North, with Dom and everything, is that I want to bring this more into the limelight of that, how actually difficult it has been, because of these different things, which have got to do with race, have got to do with a different tradition of Indian classical music that hasn't been born and bred here it's an Indian tradition, not a Western tradition, even though I learned Indian classical music in this country, which is a weird thing. I'm born and bred in Leeds and I learned all my music here, which is very, very nuanced and very layered, but yeah, like I said, I can ramble on about this for ages and ages, but I think there's a lot to unpack there for sure.
That's one of the that's such an insight really into the experiences of people from out, being brought into the opera industry and the expectations that just exist within institutions about how things are done. I think that's a really powerful picture, and it reminds me actually of line or two in Beckett's Way, when the international students are being welcomed to England and told, you will soon assimilate and find out how things are done. And it just seems to be this case of, the potential exists for welcome into our home and now do things in such a way. And I know that Opera North had lots of conversations with South Asian Arts UK, I think, which would have made your situation perhaps easier than in other opera houses because of that long-standing relationship.
Of course, I mean, like I was speaking to one of the Western musicians, and they're like, you could only have done this with Opera North because they're so open-minded to actually do a project like this on a big scale, main stage opera at Grand Theatre, 8 concerts. It was a massive risk, for them, of course. So I can't say how much, Opera North have given the space to allow that to happen, which is a really commendable feat, of course. I can't diminish that at all. And I should also mention that this is also just not in relation to Indian classical music as a genre. I think this could apply to even rock musicians, pop musicians, Irish folk musicians, Scottish folk musicians. If they came into the operatic world, I feel like they would probably have the same barriers in place, because the musical tradition doesn't really allow for that as it stands, because it's a fixed tradition that's based on reading and writing, and not all traditions of music do that. So I feel like a lot of the barriers aren't just specific to Orpheus and this production. It it is I think all opera companies need to start thinking about how to make projects like this happen, in a way that is respectful to any genre of music that comes into that. And I must say, in my long career of working with different musicians, the hardest ones have been Western classical musicians. I don't know why, but I work with jazz musicians, I work with Scottish folk musicians who are, really, really good players, but I've always found difficulty whenever working with Western classical musicians. And I don't know why that is, but that's just my own experience. I'm not saying it's like it's totally painful. It's really nice, but there is a bit of pushback in terms of like, oh, we have a specific way of doing things, so that can sometimes be a hindrance when trying to do more innovative stuff. And like I said, I believe musicians need to be versatile. You just need to be as good as you can be in this changing world that's increasingly smaller as each day goes on.
Great, and that sort of picks up on some of the things that Niamh has said in the chat. Rob, did you want to come in? I realized on this.
Well, I do. I mean, I think I'm really what Jazz is saying is so true about historically classical musicians have been quite we do things this way, but I think in my experience there's kind of a new generation of musicians who this kind of idea of being multi-skilled and being skilled across genre and things like that. There are many more performers now who are kind of developing those skills, and I think that's actually one of the things that is making these sorts of things, these sorts of productions and these sorts of approaches possible. That there are a lot of fantastic classically trained players who now improvise very happily in a number of different styles, and I think that means that change is possible, whereas in the past it might have been much harder with a group of symphonic players who just go, no, sorry, that's not, that I do that. So that idea of the richer musician, I think, is a really exciting one, and makes these things, it starts enabling these sorts of processes much more effectively. To go back to Ed's question, I mean, I think the irony really of your question is that, we had no big operatic structure behind us at all. This is something that I've made with Mkululi, with Njabulo, with Jana, the director, the producer, Ben, the director, and we've raised project funding to make this possible. And I think in a way that sort of starts answering, that sort of starts giving you a sense of my answer to this question about decolonising opera. Because when, I watched some of the last seminar that you did, and, Imani's question about, sort of saying, I don't think it's possible. I think there's something in that. I think it's, and in a way, Jasdeep's been touching on this as well, that the institution is extremely hard to decolonize, because it is an institution that relies on a very specific set of rules, a very specific set of behaviors, a very specific repertoire, and frankly, a very small part of that specific repertoire just to exist and to continue existing. And that makes the industry of opera extraordinarily difficult to decolonize in a really the sort of meaningful ways that I think we're hopefully all talking about. But I think what's not very hard to decolonize, in my view, or at least with a little bit of imagination can be done very easily, is thinking about what opera actually is and using what that is imaginatively and creatively. And I think, what is opera? It's using the voice, using music, using theater, using image, using dance, this sort of wonderful holistic form. And there's absolutely no reason that any group of musicians, actors, and theatre makers can't get together and make opera in absolutely any form they like and tell any story that they want to, using any musical and theatrical traditions and means that they want to. So I think as a medium, there are people making opera all around the world already who wouldn't call it opera, but are actually using this form in a completely uncolonial or decolonial, or not even interested in colonial sort of way. So I think that for me is the really big challenge here. And in many ways, I don't know that much about the Opera North production, apart from what you guys have been talked about, what I've read about a little bit, what Ed has told me, and it sounds like Opera North is trying to do this thing of say, well, we have this institution, we know it is going to be a difficult thing to kind of move the institution to kind of, you had that lovely image earlier, Jasdeep, of kind of moving the big truck. You know, it's exactly that thing. You've got this massive juggernaut that goes in one direction, and sort of trying to steer that in a way that takes you in a new direction or a number of different new directions. You need to be nimble, you need to be imaginative, you need to be creative with the industry and with the business of the whole thing. And that's what's necessary. You know, if we want to kind of think of opera in this way, there is that. I think also from my perspective, and I'm a composer, so I would say this, you know, I think new work is really not the only way to do this, because obviously there are many imaginative ways of engaging with the canon, but it is a difficult thing to do for a number of reasons. Obviously not impossible. We've seen that with your L'Orfeo. We've seen that with, you know, many productions of operas that have really taken it kind of out of the sort of traditional space and done really interesting imaginative things with it. But actually making new work allows you to kind of get rid of all that baggage and sort of say, well, actually, let's tell this story. Nobody's ever told this story on stage through opera before, and they've not used this type of music before, and they've not used this theatre tradition before. But let's do it because it's still opera. It's still people singing and acting and using visual image, you know, to tell stories, which is really what opera is, I think, from my perspective. It's very interesting because I've also been working, in addition to Becky's Easyway, I've been working on a few projects with Music Theatre Wales recently, and although they obviously have a very kind of deep tradition of producing what we would all recognize as contemporary opera, at the moment they're working on a number of really interesting projects where they are trying to go basically music, theatre, text, image. What could that involve? And drawing in a number of different artists from a number of different, from many different sort of environments and traditions and cultures. I shouldn't say too much, I don't think, because some of these projects aren't public yet. So, but I think in a way that's kind of what needs to be done. You know, sort of going, what is the potential of this medium if we leave the canon behind, or if we, you know, use what is beautiful and wonderful and powerful about the canon, and sort of and use what is powerful about the medium and go forward from there. That seems to me, you know, if we're talking about real decolonization, it's that, and making sure that the people who are telling the stories and the stories that they're telling are diverse and from a broad range of spaces, so that we kind of, again, it just enriches us all, basically. You know, if certain communities can tell their stories through a medium and others can't, then the medium is going to eventually, you know, need to adapt and change or die, because that's the nature of these things, in my view, anyway. So yeah, that's in a very long-winded kind of waffly sort of way. That's my sort of response to your question, I guess, Ed.
Thank you for that. Dominic, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just a couple of observations on those really, really great answers from both of you. I mean, I think the thing about the juggernaut, which I absolutely understand your experience with Opera North, Jasdeep, of trying to shift that. I think it is true that thing about it would have been hard to do this somewhere else. With other organisations, I think the thing that Opera North has maybe got right, and not only Opera North, there are other organisations doing it, but not relying only on the juggernaut, but also having outriders. So whether that's projects or relationships or partnerships, which are, I mean, you know, the partnership that Opera North has with South Asian Arts UK is 15, 20 years old, of smaller projects, which created the context in which, once the juggernaut then can be shifted, because you've done that. Whereas if you started that from scratch, it would be impossible. So having that constant curiosity about what's happening in other musical genres and in other musical organizations, that's got to be a constant. And it's something that Imani brought up in the first session, and Maggie as well, about kind of that's expensive, but it's an investment you can't not make. If you're going to have any relevance, then you've got to be constantly curious about connectivity. So I think that's, and maybe that helps toward Mia's point in the questions or in the comments about, you know, can you break down the institution? And then the other thing, just really picking up on what Rob was saying, opera, I said this in the last session, opera just means work. That's all it means. It doesn't mean it happens in a 19th century opera house. It doesn't mean it has a 59-piece orchestra and 36 chorus. It doesn't mean that. It just means work made with music. So that, you know, your project we did during lockdown with the South African cellist Abel Solochwe, that was made as a sound installation that people experienced with headphones walking around the city of Leeds. And Abel worked with our orchestra and he worked with our chorus to make that piece. And I think, Jasdeep, he probably had fewer of those, what you were describing as blocks. He probably had fewer of those because it wasn't going to end up in an opera house. Do you know what I mean? Because the whole thing was never going to be an opera. It was, or an opera in that sense. It was always going to be a sound experience for audiences walking through the streets. So in a way, the kind of defenses came down, and people were, you know, classical Western artists and singers were more relaxed about going on that journey. And I think there's something interesting about that. It comes back to what Rob was saying. You know, if change is going to happen, and also what Mia and Neve have been saying in the chat, if change is going to happen, it's going to happen by looking outside of the institution, not by changing the institution. You know, it's going to be, change is going to happen by looking outside, not by navel gazing inwards.
Yeah, Rob, come on in.
I mean, I think the other thing, and what sounds very, very powerful about what Dom was saying there about relationships being built up over 15, 20 years. I think so much of this, and I guess Jasdeep, you were talking about the same thing, is that the you know, this sort of stuff happens when you have long, deep, thoughtful conversations about stuff, you know, and work out how to work together in ways that are positive and meaningful, you know. And I think, you know, you were talking about tokenism earlier as well, you know, which is exactly the opposite of that. And I do think that these things also take time, and they take real kind of effort and engagement. And, you know, I've worked on some projects where recently where you have to kind of, where we're talking two different languages and trying to kind of go, okay, well, this is how I'm seeing it. How's it been seen on your side of the table? How's it been seen on your side of the table? And where do we find where is the meeting point that we can all work productively? And that just takes time. Sometimes it is sometimes difficult, but it has to happen for this sort of work to be meaningful, I think. And you know, I think that's the other really important thing, is that it's not about kind of going, oh, we need to make more African opera, right? Let's phone up some African opera singers, put them on stage and get them to sing. You know, oh, what are we going to get them to sing? Oh, let's get some drummers. Okay, and you know, it needs to be much deeper than that. It needs to be about conversation, about bringing people in who can work in between these spaces as well, which I think is the other kind of, again, going back to what I was saying earlier in response to Jasdeep's point about musicians needing to be broader and richer. They're the people who are able to make this sort of thing happen, I think, or we're kind of getting into that space now, which is really crucial, I think.
Yeah, Jazz, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think I had a thought and then it went, but I think yeah, being meaningful, and sometimes I always feel like in this case, this with Opera North and South Asian arts coming together, this has been one of the rare projects where it's been kind of thought out by the organizations and really kind of worked upon at different points, and then it's kind of come to fruition. But usually, in my experience, wherever an organization said, "Okay, let's get a sitar player and a tap dancer and a you know, and some of the concoction of different artists, and get them together and put them on a residency for a week, and then they'll perform a concert at the end, and we've done something meaningful." You know, that's also, as you touched upon there with your kind of with, let's get some African singers and let's get some drummers and put them together and hope for the best. And oh, it wasn't that good. Okay, we'll never do it again. You know, and that's the diversity tick box and gone back 10 years. You know, that you know, for one, in my own opinion, I've always gone by my gut about what I feel like I want to do. And having artists lead the conversations in that sense about what actually is meaningful to them as artists and where they want to see their art grow, and what they want to present, I think is a very, very important thing to take in considerations whenever having these when talking about innovation and things, because really I get so annoyed by where Indian classical musicians specifically get called in to do projects where they don't use any of their training at all, to kind of deliver the concert. They don't draw upon their tradition in any meaningful way, and that for me feels like they're not developing their own personal development, but also of the genre and the art form. That is something that I feel like. But obviously, that's me as an artist speaking. I feel that artists need to spearhead their music, their art form, and things. But I mean, Orpheus has been a project that has not been that in the kind of where it was thought up. It was thought up by the organizations, and bringing in the personnel that needed to kind of make that come to fruition. So that also does work as well. But for me, it had to be in a very specific way for me to come in and deliver that was meaningful. So, and Opera and Opera were very, very open to allowing that to move in the direction that it needed to move. But I'm just kind of putting thoughts out there, really. I haven't really thought about it much myself, but if we're talking about innovation within genres, within opera, or however you want to call opera, I do think artists spearheading that movement is quite important, for sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and there's a couple of comments or questions that have come up either in the chat or in the Q&A that I thought would be a way of kind of bringing some of these themes hopefully together. And one sort of picks up on some of the themes about musicians and skill sets, and really drives home this idea about position and whose role does what. I'm bringing in Neve's idea about decolonizing work as looking outward, moving outward, as opposed to inviting in. And we've touched on that in a variety of ways, I think, over this conversation. But the other thing I think it highlights for me is this should make us be thinking about the relative power relationships in play here. Because if we begin from a framework of inviting someone in, whether that's inviting someone into a particular space or a particular tradition, there are responsibilities to a host, but there are also power differentials. And so to invite someone into an opera house or to invite someone into any space implies a particular kind of relationship, and being conscious of that and perhaps working to ameliorate those kinds of power differentials could be something to take forward as an institution or as an individual, as projects, thinking about how to actually put that into practice. I was also thinking that linked into really a point of criticism for anyone who is a musician in that Western classical tradition, who is, I'm speaking for myself as much as anyone else here, linked to that score, kind of clings to that written tradition and the accumulated expertise that has defined Western classical musicians, to loosen up a little bit, to recognize that there are other skills, other knowledges that we might be able to productively benefit from. The other comment, there was a question from Alex about the potential of opera in post-colonial societies. So we've been talking about here in the UK within the metropole, to use some common language. But what about opera elsewhere? Is it possible to actually take opera in a colonial society or in a post-colonial society and to decolonize it within that environment? Now, Rob, would you like to jump in there?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really fascinating question, and as said a little, I talked a little bit about this earlier. I suppose this kind of issue in South Africa, just which is what I know. So forgive me for going on about it, but it's the space that I know. The sort of great irony of opera in South Africa is that opera singers in South Africa want to sing opera in big, inverted commas. They want to sing Verdi, Puccini, Mozart, all the kind of big things. There are singers who are open to sing other things and taking on other kind of interesting new work. And there's quite an interesting sort of move. I think Mia could probably talk more about this than I can, but people like Bongani and Ndada Breen writing, Winnie the Opera about Winnie Mandela, or, which is still kind of a very much a piece in the traditional opera mold and intended for that sort of performance space and for that sort of audience, but obviously opening it up much more broadly using a big kind of political figure like Winnie Madikizela Mandela. So there's that, and Cape Town Opera did a number of productions where they commissioned a number of composers to write pieces, sort of following the Scottish opera model from sort of the early 2000s of 20-minute operas, or in my case I was involved in a production of 4 30-minute operas. Actually, that's where I met Mkhululi, who was working on one of the other projects, so he and I kind of both had a piece in that project. But there are also really interesting things like Mzilikazi Kumalo writing his Shaka piece, or Opera Africa, I think they're called, in KwaZulu-Natal, who've been working on sort of pieces that kind of combine traditional Zulu music into sort of big operatic spectacles involving Zulu dance, Zulu costumes, and Zulu history, and almost exclusively in Zulu in that particular instance. So there are people kind of sort of looking at the margins and kind of being sort of going away from the sort of big operatic traditions, but certainly I think Cape Town Opera has done remarkably well in commissioning new work, given what the resource they have. They have produced actually a remarkable number of new pieces given that, but really they are able to put on a few kind of, now much more recently, it's been kind of a few big, pretty standard operas, and that's what they can manage. So decolonisation sort of needs to happen there, but is really, really kind of restricted by perceptions of audience, perceptions of what people want to sing, what people want to hear, what is financially, very just about manageable, and all of those sorts of things. So, I mean, again, there are many people who can talk more meaningfully about this than I can, but that's my perception at the moment, is that, it's at this stage, it's a question of how do we keep opera surviving? How do we keep putting opera on stage? And there are people looking at it from other angles and trying to kind of do different things with it, and there are new works being written, but there is a survival element of it as well. And again, like I said, I'm sure there are others who can say more about it than I can.
Jas, do you want to? I've got a hand.
Yeah, it's actually about another question that I've just seen in the comments. But if anyone wants to add on to Rob, feel free.
I think you're up.
Oh, okay. I just saw a question in there about cultural appropriation. I don't know if you can see that question by is it Rika? I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry about that. How do you stop the genuine collaboration between cultures from tipping over into culturally appropriation, e.g. Western classical musicians learning the process method of Indian classical music and then being hired over an Indian classical musician on a project such as Orpheus? That would never happen in my production, because because I could tell the difference between a Western classical vocalist trying to sing Indian classical music. So one thing that is very important to me is that, and in any kind of cross-cultural collaborations, is that I would never ask a Western musician who is trained in a certain way to try and sing Indian embellishments. It makes no sense whatsoever. For me, the process was finding ways in which the tradition the two traditions can come together in a way that is musically tasteful. So one example So, for example, in Monteverdi, the vocal embellishment was expected for 16th century operatic singers. They were expected to embellish lines in a way that was tasteful and that was kind of meaningful in their own tradition. So, for example, in Monteverdi, the place of embellishment usually comes before the cadence hits. So, for example, contento, that would be a Western way of embellishing a line. So with Indian classical music, we usually embellish a line after the sun has hit the first beat of the bar or first beat of the time cycle. So how do you get these to work in parallel with each other that doesn't cross onto the feet? One way of doing that was having one singer singing the contento, there's a meeting point where you have one at the end of the cadence, one before, embellishing in a way that is tasteful to their tradition. It is traditional to their tradition, but in a way that doesn't step on each other's toes and carries meaning and is respectful to both things. So that was one little example of how that can work within that thing. So it's not appropriating the style, is keeping your style there and present, but finding ways to meld in a way that that allows for that beauty to happen. So in Office, that was one thing that I found was a good little nitbit, was to have the embellishments coming in the appropriate place, which is appropriate to the tradition, but is also respectful for the music that is there in the first place. So I've done that so many different ways. That was one example. One with the Monteverdi, with my own compositions, I found ways of putting the Western musicians in there, but in a way that is tasteful to the music, but also tasteful to their tradition. So I'm not asking them to appropriate other people, the other styles. It's actually highlighting the best of their style, but in a way that is presentable and that is respectful and sounds nice. You know, I judge it by my ear. If it sounds good, it stays in. If it sounds naff, then I won't do it. You know, like that. And that comes with experience, you know, and it comes with knowing the styles and being respectful and showing that you have studied the styles effectively and know it and find the beauty in each style. And that's where I feel like when we did Orpheus, there was a mutual respect because we were learning so much about each other's styles. And you know, there's points where I was like, oh my God, this singer is just amazing. But I didn't want them to sing Indian embellishments because it would have sounded naff in that voice, you know. So try to find meaning in ways that would bring the styles together, but doesn't trample all over the other tradition. That's my kind of motto with working with two different styles. So I get very passionate about this, as you can imagine, but there are ways of bringing traditions together meaningfully, for sure.
And that really highlights to me, at least, the importance of those relationships. There is no singular way of doing something, as Alex suggests. One way of glossing that is to put people of color or people with expertise in these traditions in positions of power within opera houses. And I think that's certainly one way of thinking through this. So those relationships, that intimacy, that trust that is built across time is one way of getting to a product which is artistically meaningful, culturally meaningful in all kinds of different ways. We are very nearly out of time. So I just wanted to open the floor one last time if anyone has any kind of final comments that they'd like to make before we close for today. If not, that's more than fine. We've had a lot of food for thought, and we do have some more seminars coming up for this. I'm going to turn back over to Ed and Lucien just to close us out.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you everyone for a wonderful discussion. Yes, so our next webinar is in a fortnight, and the topic of conversation, I think, will follow on very naturally, from today's webinar, we'll be looking at issues of collaboration and the invitation to collaborate. So I think we'll be delving deeper into these issues. Please do follow us on Twitter if you haven't already. And a couple more links, QR codes to the form if you haven't accessed it elsewhere, and the event listings on our project website as well. Do keep checking that for updates on what we're doing. But Ariana and everyone on the panel, particularly Rob and Jazz, for coming to join us. Thank you all. And thank you to everyone in the audience as well for your comments, your questions, and please do fill in the form and give us some feedback and suggestions for our future events. Thank you, everyone.